You're listening to a download from the outdoorstation.co.uk. Number 530.
Hello and welcome to another podcast here on The Outdoors Station. I'm Bob Cartwright, and The Outdoors Station is the longest running outdoors podcast in the world. We've over 500 podcasts available in our library, and if you check us out wherever you get your podcast from, you can go back through hundreds of stories and interviews. This is part one of a two-part series on Grandma Gatewood, a name that's whispered in reverent tones throughout the international lightweight hiking community. I first became aware of her iconic status some 25 years ago from the few brief mentions in Ray Jardine's book Beyond Backpacking, which has turned into a Bible for lightweight enthusiasts. I'm sure everyone knows the gist of the story. In 1955, a 67-year-old granny became the first woman to thru-hike the 2,050-mile Appalachian Trail, carrying a 15-pound pack of minimal gear. And generally, that's about all we know. Well, tonight we're going deeper into the backstory of Emma Gatewood, the person she was and why she holds such a justified, iconic position in history, and how her legacy is affecting lives of those heading outdoors today, with Pulitzer Prize finalists and author of the New York Times best-selling biography, Ben Montgomery. This audio is extracted from the live stream video interview I did just recently with Ben. It's split into two sections, the first one giving sort of a backstory and history of Emma and how her life developed before she set out on the walk. And part two is all about the walk itself and the legacy she left behind. Nice to have you aboard, Ben. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time in what is your afternoon, isn't it? It's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the US. So I'm really looking forward to delving into the story and some of the backstory of Grandma Gatewood. So first of all, let's just start with your relationship, because you have a fairly unique perspective to have written this story.
Sure enough, I was a newspaper reporter at the Tampa Bay Times here in Florida, and wrote a story that got a lot of attention, not about hiking or about the outdoors, but it wound up in the hands of a literary agent in New York who called and said, "Do you have any book ideas?" And I did. This was sort of every young writer's dream, but it fell into my lap. My mother used to tell me stories, bedtime stories, about this distant relative of ours who was the first woman to solo through hike the Appalachian Trail. And I only knew a little about her, some sort of stories of her adventures. Mom used to tell me that somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, she scared off a black bear with her umbrella. She was just this character that existed that I was always fond of. But when it came, when I had this opportunity to do a book, I started looking around, and nobody had given her serious biographical treatment. She shows up in books like you just referred to, and Larry Luxemburg's book of vignettes about Appalachian Trail pioneers and a few others. So I thought, now it's time to take a deep dive into her life and figure out who this woman really was, and in a way try to solidify her mark on American hiking, on hiking in general, and her impact specifically on the Appalachian Trail, the preservation of the people's path, as my shirt calls it.
Well, she certainly became one of the most famous pedestrians, I think, in the US during that period. And obviously her legacy lives on. But she lived through very turbulent times, didn't she? She was born in the late 1880s. And so she went through, a whole series of historical moments that must have been pretty hard going.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And you got them listed there, but let's march right through them. this was not an easy period of time to be a woman, to be a mother, to be a grandmother in the United States of America. She, of course, lived through the First World War. Her own father had been had fought in the Revolutionary War. She was she was married around the age of 18, so really really early. She married a 28-year-old man, but she lived through the Spanish flu. We're kind of dealing with some of that right now with the pandemic that's spread across the world. And by the way, she was birthing kids about one every year or two for the first couple of decades of her marriage. She wound up giving birth to 11 living children, had a couple of miscarriages, but that was more common at the time, primarily because, especially in that area of southeastern Ohio, which is known kind of as the Midwest, but it butts up against the Appalachian Mountains, which run up the eastern seaboard of the United States. And she was a farm woman. She married a guy who was a school teacher, but also a farmer, and they started having these kids primarily to take care of the jobs on the farm. The market crashed, as you've got mentioned there, Black Friday, 1929, October of 1929, and that sent the economy here in the U.S. into a tailspin. Of course, it was tailspinning in other parts of the world, but it led to what we call the Great Depression. And this was a period in American history where a quarter of the American population was completely out of work. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 million men and women, sometimes children, were crisscrossing the country by rail car, looking for employment opportunities, looking for ways to survive. There were, of course, food riots in places like Oklahoma and Arkansas. This was, not an easy time to scrape by. And she's bringing up, a whole gaggle of children on a farm. It was a very hard scrabble life. Everybody got an assignment. From the time you were 2 or 3 years old, you were given chores: sweep the floor, collect the eggs from the chickens. When you got a little older, maybe they sent you to work in the fields. So this was a tough way to make a living, tough way to eke out a living. But she and her husband at the time, P.C. Gatewood, did it. And she, many people told me that she could often be found working from sun up by kerosene lantern, working in the garden, all the way until sundown, right next door to the men that her husband had hired.
Sure. Well, we're going to come on to her actual life from school onwards, and obviously some of the stories about her married life and some of the trials and tribulations that she went through, which pretty well sets the tone for the type of woman that she became in many respects. But one thing I have negated to do, and I do apologise, is of course I haven't introduced Rose, who is currently in the chat room overseeing the chat. Say hello to everybody, Rose. You're there now? No? Hello, Rose?
Hi. Yeah, I am here.
So she's in the chat room. So what we'll be doing is putting links to Ben's various books and anything else that we discuss as time goes by. But I'd like to really get stuck into her life, because there's a lot to get through in this interview, and every section is equally as important as the previous, to be honest. But let's start from, as you started and hinted initially, her school life and getting married to PC, which was really the start of things. I have no idea. There's no mention in your book of what her childhood was like before that, whether it was a happy childhood or a rural childhood, but I presume it was before she got married and things changed.
Yeah, she, for as hard scrabble as her people were at that time, trying to eke out a living in southeastern Ohio, she had fond memories of her childhood and had fond memories of both of her parents. But it was often, she went to school. I think we have a photo of this, but she went to school only through the 8th grade, which was as high as you could go in terms of standard education. And some of her children were under the impression that she had actually repeated the 8th grade a couple of times just to take full advantage of the public schooling that was offered to her. And she was a lifelong reader. She adored reading books and magazines. It was just a part of who she was. And, like I said, when she was 18 years old, she married a guy named P.C. Gatewood, who was a school teacher, sometimes bus driver, sometimes farmer, kind of a handyman, well known around the area where they lived in southeastern Ohio. He was considered a catch. He fancied himself a brilliant man, would often in church, when the pastor was finished, he would often stand up and deliver a sermon of his own, even though he wasn't on staff at the church, but he would get up and orate for a couple of hours, after the service had closed. He was also an abusive man, and this was not discovered until by anyone outside of their family until much later. It was kind of a family secret, but starting early on in their marriage, PC was violent with his wife, with Emma Gatewood, and she described in several diaries that she left behind the beatings that he inflicted upon her. Her children told me as well that they remembered their father's short fuse, his temper, his anger. A couple of them witnessed him beat a horse half to death. Now, he never touched the children so far as they said, but he was violent with Emma on a very regular basis. And so, in fact, she wrote in a diary that she was never pregnant or with child when he did not lay hands on her. So in other words, every child that she gave birth to, she took a beating while she was pregnant with that child. Unfortunately, at that time in that part of the world, it was not an easy thing to get divorced. It was not an easy thing to leave a household like this. She had nowhere to turn. Her family was all, most of them had moved to the West Coast, to California. And a couple of times after especially brutal beatings, when most of the children were older, she left her small town of Gallipolis, Ohio, and went to visit family on the West Coast with the idea that she might stay there for a while so that P.C. Gatewood got the message that she was serious about leaving him. She thought he was going to kill her. And so we know that on two different occasions she fled for the West Coast, and eventually he was able to convince her to come back home and rejoin the family. So, she did right up until the very end. And I don't know if you want me to get into this now, Bob, but he delivered an especially brutal beating in which he pulled part of her ear off. He broke a couple of ribs, broke out some teeth, and she thought, if I allow him to do this again, if I stick around, he's going to kill me. And it was around this time that she decided to file for divorce. This was 1941, and she went to a courthouse in West Virginia, filed for divorce from P.C. Gatewood. He didn't oppose that divorce. He never showed up in court to face the accusations, and so she was granted a divorce and granted a certain settlement for him. And she kind of went on and took the remaining kids who hadn't yet grown out of the household. She kind of took them and carried on with her life, living as a single, independent woman.
Yeah. I mean, you detail a couple of things in the book here, which I think are worth mentioning. Not that a case I just want to exaggerate the situation, but I think it gives a bit of background, a bit more depth to the woman herself. As I understand it, she was only 5'2", 5'1" from the various descriptions that I've picked up. So she was a very slight woman. And as you report in the book, there's occasions where the PC broke a broom over her head at one stage. She had such a heavy beatings that it's just incredible that she was able to withstand it. But as I understand it also, and again, just sort of reading the book again, that was the times that she would also retreat to the sanctuary of the woods and the forests to get some peace and hopefully recover in some sort of way, but just get some distance while he cooled down. And I presume that began the healing process. But I'd like you to just complete the story you almost started there about the time that, the last time that he beat her, when she was, I think, 51, roughly. So, and as she stated that he beat her senseless 10 times that particular 1938, I think it was. And then tell us what happened next.
Yeah, a little bit more context. Theirs was a very difficult relationship, and depending on who you talk to, they all folks who knew them together sort of all saw it in different ways. In fact, one of her nephews told me that he remembered a fight when he was a young boy staying at their house. He remembered a fight in which PC started beating on Emma, and she ran out the back door and she hid in the back of some kind of a carriage, horse-drawn buggy of some sort that was filled with hay or corn or something like that. And she jumped into the back of it to try to hide and to try to get away from him. And he came running out the back of the house and grabbed some sort of farm implement that was leaned up against the wall, like a hoe. And one of his farm hands grabbed him and said, "You need to leave her alone. You're going to kill her." And she shouted from the back of this hiding place. She said, "You leave him alone. This is our fight." So, you get the sense from some of these stories that she was not a person who just rolled over and took this, but in fact fought back, defended herself. But when she couldn't and when she was scared, she left for the woods. She would often retreat to the woods to let him cool down. And she found a certain safe harbor in nature. Sometimes she would stay overnight. Sometimes she would sit upon rocks and write poetry, looking over the banks of the Ohio River. But you get the sense in reading what she wrote about these experiences that nature became her refuge. And so it's not surprising then to advance forward a decade or so and find her developing this deep interest to hike the entirety of the Appalachian Trail.
Sure. Well, I was wondering if you were going to tell us a story about the time she got arrested. She got beaten, and as a result, she ended up getting arrested.
Apologize for that. Yeah, sure enough. So they get into a fight. Nobody can remember the exact details of this, but PC had convinced their friends and neighbors that Emma was a crazy person. And that she deserved to, he would often threaten her, "If you keep this up, if you keep giving me this attitude, I'm going to have you sent to an insane asylum." And this was no place that any woman wanted to be in the 1930s, 40s, 50s. And so it sort of kept her quiet, at least changed the way that people who lived around them thought about her and thought about their relationship. And he had done a good job of convincing also the local authorities that she was crazy. And so one day they get into a fight. He beats her up real bad, goes off and returns to the house with a friend of his who was something like a justice of the peace, a constable in that area. And he came back and he was fully ready to arrest Emma. Well, when PC walked through the door, she hurled a sack of flour that connected squarely with his face and kind of exploded into his face. And just beyond that, the guy that PC had brought took Emma into custody and put her in jail in a place called Barker's Ridge, West Virginia, where she stayed at least one night before she was given an audience with the mayor of this small town. And she convinced him that she was, in fact, a battered spouse and that, prison jail was not a place for her. And he saw through the charade. He knew that this was a battered spouse. And so this kind mayor of this small town actually got her employment at a local cafe, got her out of jail, set her up with a place to live. And this set her on her path toward fully breaking away from PC and filing for divorce.
Yeah. I mean, as it happens, I've got my mother divorced in the 40s, 50s, I think it was. And she was telling me just what a social leper she became. Nobody wanted to speak to her. She was the talk of the town. She had to move away from wherever she was. It really was a socially charged thing to do, and very, very shocking. And I think we've got a picture here of her just after her divorce, which I understood from, again, reading the book, was the time she said she started to enjoy life again, and the children reflected on that. Yeah,
that's exactly right. I think she really started to find herself with that new level of independence, where she wasn't at the beck and call of an abusive, hard-fisted, oppressive husband who had convinced everybody else that she was crazy. Once she was outside of that, then she started to become a woman in full. She did what she wanted to do, and often that meant work, but it also meant visiting friends on foot. It meant taking trips into the woods. It meant testing herself against the earth with the idea that someday she might have the ambition to walk a long distance. And that's what she did. And you start to see in some of the poetry that she left behind, you start to see her really embrace her role as a citizen, but also as a human in that period. She would write these very lovely poems about the wildflowers that were blooming in the spring, or about the bend in the Ohio River, or about watching tugboats come up the river and dock there at Gallia County. So it was a neat moment for her. And you really, somebody like me or a biography who has access to this material that she's left behind, you start to see her like really come out as a full human being, as a full person with a level of independence that, that we all deserve.
Yeah, well, she was also born in October. That makes her a Libran, which is usually the sort of the creative star sign. I would say that because I'm a Libran as well. And we'll come on to one of her poems. We've actually got one of her published poems in the slideshow a bit later on there. But she was very eloquent, considering the sort of life that she'd had, obviously, with PC. But then, of course, there was that moment where she saw the National Geographic.
That's right. And nobody is sure when exactly or where exactly she came into contact with this particular issue of the National Geographic. But, we know that it was published in August of 1949. And so perhaps it was sitting around in a doctor's office or something like that. Her children recall this being the moment when her eyes were open to the idea of the Appalachian Trail. It was a fairly new footpath in August of 1949. I'm saying new because it had just kind of been pieced together and just connected. Of course, it was dreamed up by a guy named Benton Mackay, who stood atop a bluff in somewhere in the northeastern United States and looked south down the Blue Ridge of the Appalachian Mountain chain and said, we need to take steps right now to preserve a footpath so that primarily so anybody who lives, now at the time, 60% of the U.S. population lived along the eastern seaboard. And so he envisioned a footpath connecting north to south that would be within a day's drive or a day's journey of anybody who lived in the area who wanted to just go be in the wilderness and take a long walk. And so in the late 1920s, he proposed the idea. And trail clubs along the Appalachian Range began to establish themselves and began to work to piece together the People's Path, the Appalachian Trail. And eventually that extended, by 1955, to about 2,050 miles. It started at Mount Oglethorpe in the state of Georgia on the southern end and ran to Mount Katahdin in the state of Maine on the northern end. Like I said, it ran close to or within a day's drive of about 60% of the U.S. population. So the beauty of that 1949 National Geographic piece is it contains some very flowery language. It contains a bunch of beautiful photos of the trail. And it sort of famously says that anybody in moderate physical condition could hayfoot, strawfoot from Georgia to Maine without much difficulty. It said the trail was as wide as a Mack truck in many places, and there was food to find along the way, and there were suppliers along the way. And so, in retrospect, it created a pretty roseate picture of what it might take to walk the entire Appalachian Trail. And there's reason to believe that, Emma set out to do this, thinking this trail would be kind of a walk in the park, that it'd be pretty easy to chip off 2,050 miles and even fun. And of course, she found that not to be completely the case.
The National Outdoor Expo aims to bring the whole outdoor community together under one roof at the NEC in Birmingham, March 2021. Aimed at walkers, climbers, campers and runners, it's going to be a show full of inspiration, kit, tech, nutrition and advice needed to be more active outside. The outdoor station is going to be there too, talking with adventurers and brands galore. Plus, we're giving away 10 free tickets every week until the event to our listeners and viewers who like, comment and share our weekly random Outdoor Expo posts on Twitter and Instagram. To enter, keep your eye on our social media accounts, and when you see a free ticket posting, like it, comment on it and share it with someone to take with you to the expo. You're limited to one entry per account each week until March, and winners will be chosen at random. Full terms and conditions can be found over on the outdoorstation.co.uk website. The National Outdoor Expo is on the 27th and 28th of March 2021. We'll see you there. So would she be aware of Earl Schaefer's initial trip, do you think? Would she think she knew about that before she started?
It's a fine question. You know, Earl Schaefer, who was the first person that we know of to log a registered through hike, when he completed his in 1948, the ATC, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, doubted his account. The forefathers of the AT never imagined anybody trying to walk the whole thing in one go. It was just not in the realm of how they saw users, taking advantage of the trail. So he had to actually send in slides and some of his journals to try to prove to the authorities that he had in fact walked the entire thing in one season. Schaefer was a World War II veteran who wrote about needing to kind of shake off the ghosts of the war, something we probably think of today as PTSD, and of course a lot of soldiers back from wartime wind up even now on the AT trying to find themselves or trying to put things back together, figure out who they are, their place in the world. So Earl was the pioneer of that sort. I think Earl Schaefer had been mentioned in that 49 National Geographic piece. You'd have to check my work on that. But his the fact that he did this in one go did not make news. I think it had been noted in the ATC's newsletter that went out to all the members, but it wasn't a giant deal. It certainly didn't wind up in the New York Times or anything like that. I actually met in person the second person to ever complete a through hike, a guy named Gene Espy from Georgia.
Oh, really?
Who I think is still with us, although he's way up in years. But Gene did it as a young man. I think he'd been a former Boy Scout, and he told me that there was the second person to complete a solo through hike, Gene Espy, he got one story in the Macon, Georgia newspaper, his hometown newspaper. But outside of that, it wasn't a big deal. Really, until Grandma Gatewood came along, not many people knew about the AT, knew about the history of the AT. Her hikes really introduced Americans at large to the trail.
Well, certainly I want to come on to that and talk about that perhaps towards the end, about the impact and the legacy that she left and other things that have happened since then. Sure. But certainly looking at her approach now, we're coming on to obviously her first walk, which wasn't actually in 1955, it was in 1954, and things didn't quite go to plan. So would you like to give us a brief synopsis of what happened on that first trip and perhaps what she learned from it, really? What did she gain from that trip? Because I haven't seen any recorded comments that she learned X, Y or Z about it, or she changed her equipment in any particular way. And we'll also come on to her equipment and stuff a bit later on as well.
Sure. So she kept this secret, I feel like she was kind of embarrassed by it. So she didn't tell a lot of people what she had done. But in 1954, a year before she completed her first solo through hike, she left home and made her way to the north end of the Appalachian Trail and climbed Mount Katahdin, carrying much the same equipment that she carried on her later hikes. As you can see in the photos, she carried a denim drawstring sack that she had sewn herself at home. And inside of it, meager supplies, which we can get into later. But she started at Mount Katahdin, and she didn't make it but about 100 miles before she got lost in the woods of Maine. And when I say lost, she just completely lost the trail. She had wandered up to the bank of a lake and stopped to take a rest. And when she went to collect her things and to set off, headed south again, she couldn't find the trail. She couldn't find it headed south. She couldn't find it headed back to where she had come from. And so this was, if you believe what she wrote about this experience, this was a moment when she decided she had stayed around there for a little while. She started to run out of food. She accidentally stepped on her glasses and broke her glasses, and she was basically blind without her glasses. And she wrote that, she decided if I'm going to die, this is as good and as beautiful a place as any. And so she laid down with the idea that this was it. This is the end of the road for her. And it wasn't, she doesn't write about it after the fact in a way that was sad. She had just sort of come to terms with it. After a little while, she decided, you know what? I'm going to give it another shot. By this time, the state park rangers in Maine, in Baxter State Park, had begun looking for her, and they were flying a prop plane overhead. She had seen the plane a couple of times, but she couldn't get anybody's attention. So she decided she would give it one more go, and started traipsing through the woods, found the trail that she had lost, and rather than head back south, she decided she would go back north, restock, rethink, resupply, and maybe give it another go at some point. She walked back into the ranger camp at a place called Rainbow Lake, and the rangers who had been out looking for her were taking a break and throwing some horseshoes. And when she walked into their camp, looking terrible, looking beat up, she had been bitten on the eye by a black fly. Her glasses were broken. I'm sure she was dirty and pretty exhausted. She walked back into camp, and they told her, "This is no place for a woman your age. You need to go home, Grandma." And this hurt her. This was, again, a man telling her what she should and should not be doing. Well, she retreated to her hotel, stayed a night in Bangor, Maine, looked at herself in the mirror, decided, you know what, it's not over. I'm going to go home this time, but I'm going to plan a little better and come back next time. And so she started regrouping. And in between 1954 and 1955, she didn't change much in terms of gear. She decided that she would try to go from the south to the north, which is more conducive with the seasons here in the U.S. But didn't change much at all in terms of what she brought. She didn't tell anybody about that experience until much later. But it was hurtful for her. She left Maine in defeat, but the kind of defeat that makes you want to hit it again.
You've mentioned, obviously, her diary and her journals, and we've actually got an excerpt of one to show people a bit later on. But I'm just curious, as part of your research for doing the book, did you have access to everything? Did you read everything that she had written? And when did she start writing a journal or a diary? Did she start it when she was with PC, or was that did that come afterwards?
This was a pretty common thing for her to keep a journal or a diary, and her youngest daughter, Lucy, who became my dear friend. She's a second cousin of mine, I think, but maybe a third cousin. But we became friends. She's now in her 90s. She lives here in Florida. Anyhow, she kept all of her mother's stuff, and so there were banker's boxes full of journals, diaries. What Lucy had done with these trail diaries, because they're, I think she probably suspected that they were going to be an important piece of ephemera for American history. Lucy retyped them all. They had been written in hand on little lined notebooks that Emma carried on the trail, but Lucy retyped them all to make them more legible and more accessible to people who might be interested in Emma's experiences. And she told me that, it was not uncommon for Emma to keep this journal, but I don't know what has become of the journals that she kept before she started hiking the AT. I know those journals are intact and kept with Lucy and another granddaughter, but anyhow, they provide little snapshots into certain times in her life. And then what else I thought was super useful in terms of getting to know Emma was a lot of the correspondence that Lucy had kept as well. So there was letters back and forth from Emma to her children, from other people to Emma, and Lucy had kept all these together. One of the other beautiful things for a guy like me who wants to write a story like this, Emma had kept scrapbooks. So every time a newspaper along the AT or elsewhere had written a story about her, she'd gotten a copy of the story, and then she'd made small corrections in the margins, which I don't know if you know this, but once in a while the newspapers might get a detail or two wrong. Anyhow, Emma would correct those, and it's fantastic. So the story might say something like, her pack weighed 32 pounds, and Emma would correct it and say, my pack actually weighed 24 pounds, for instance. They would say she wore size 7 shoes, and she would correct that, or what have you. And this is just good because like fact checking, from the source who died 5 years before I was born. It was really helpful in terms of trying to get things as right as possible.
Fabulous. Okay, so let's actually get on to the story of the first crossing before we get on to all the various other things that she achieved. So you hadn't really changed very much. I mean, the listing that I've approximately got is the one that's well recorded, really. The small bag, a man's jacket, a blanket, wearing kids' sneakers. I mean, basically, it was all homemade stuff because that was the type of experience that people had. That was what was available. There wasn't a case of the whole high-tech, let's go lightweight technical fabrics that we have today. And I'd like to touch on that a bit later on as well and see what Emma might have thought of that. But she just basically, what needs must. And by the sound of it, she was that sort of character that lived that life in a rural existence where she would make do and mend. She took a gingham dress, which my wife reliably informs me is the perfect thing to do because it doesn't crease. So therefore, when she changed out of her men's dungarees into something respectable for town, she would fit in. But she set off, and she didn't set off to do anything apart from achieve it for her own benefits. And we'll come on to the bit about the celebrity status and when that started to happen. But how was it her first walk, her first few weeks? What I have got here is a few slides of historical pictures taken on Appalachian area. So I'll run through those as you're talking.
Yeah. So maybe for a little bit of context, it's important to understand that when folks came across the pond to the New World, a lot of them didn't have access to the Western United States, primarily because the Appalachian Mountains separate the East Coast from Greater America. And so a lot of folks wound up kind of getting hemmed in. They ran out of money, they ran out of luck, they ran out of whatever. And they started forming little mountain communities through Appalachia. And some of these communities still exist today, much in the same way that they did in the early 20th century. These slides illustrate as much. It was a hard scrabble life. They staked out little mountainous claims and tried to make farms, in the hills. And I think because of the geology of the area, these people became super self-reliant. Travel wasn't easy. Getting around was super difficult. And so they became self-reliant. They did for themselves. They raised their own food. They lived by a creed that if the birds don't go hungry, then we shouldn't either. That there's plenty of abundance of food and whatnot in nature. So they made their own furniture. They made their own homes. These were a reliant, resilient people, and it's the same stock that she came out of. So when she set off in 1955, it was a time when even though the roads building program in the U.S. was going great guns, it was a time in which a lot of people in Appalachia never had any contact with the outside world. And so visitors were rare. Certainly somebody just kind of walking up to the farm would have been very rare. it didn't happen. They were disconnected by the mountains to the rest of the world. And so I think probably as a result of this, they were a little distrusting of visitors. Emma ran into some interesting experiences right at first. And we're talking about as she left Georgia and came into North Carolina, she ran into people who were suspicious of her, who didn't believe that she was walking from Georgia to Maine, because why would anyone do that? And of course, these were hardscrabble farm people. So she sometimes had to prove who she was. And in one instance, she walks up to a farm and there's a farmer sitting on the porch, as I recall, drinking a glass of tea. His wife is out in the field working. And Emma introduces herself, says she's walking from Georgia to Maine. And the guy says, "Oh, yeah, well, prove it." And so she's got to go into her bag to get out some identification to prove she is who she says she is. But this guy thinks that she is an agent of the federal government in Washington, D.C., come to, I don't know, mess up his life or something like that. So the folks, a lot of the folks that she met early on were super distrusting. By the way, this is also a time in history in which there was sort of feuds going on, not just between families in Appalachia, but also between people who were making illegal moonshine, which is, mash whiskey, making illegal moonshine, and revenuers, the IRS, the federal agents who were trying to impose taxes on that illegal moonshine or trying to regulate the sale of that illegal moonshine. And so some wars, small skirmishes going on from time to time in Appalachia between moonshiners and revenuers. So this is the world through which she was walking in that era. One other thing that she pointed out that I thought probably is true today. She said the larger the house, the less likely the homeowner would be to let her stay the night. So she found the folks who lived in the little houses far more welcoming to a stranger than the folks who were a little more well off, who were perhaps more suspicious or less likely to let her in, to let her stay in the barn, to let her sleep on the porch or whatnot.
We've certainly found it ourselves, and I've said it in previous podcasts, we found that the people with the least give the most. And it always seems to be the same wherever you go in the world. Now, a lot of people, there was a bit of conversation that's been going on online before we started this interview, and when I was promoting it last week, and a few people were sort of querying the fact, how did she manage to survive as regards calories and calorific way? Would she be able to carry enough food and survive that way? And there was a discussion going on that she wouldn't be able to live off berries. But I think it's a combination of things, isn't it? From what I read in the book, she was obviously adept at collecting berries and knew what wild fruits and things were available to her. She wasn't averse to eating roadkill, and she would often have a fire. I think most of the time, from the way I read it, she would have a fire if possible. But she didn't use the fire for cooking, unless it was cooking the roadkill. She was using that for warmth and for drying her clothes out. But on a regular basis, I know during the early parts of the 20s, 30s, during the Depression period, she was known locally for welcoming people that were looking for work, at least giving them a meal or something to drink or whatever. So she had no aversion in going up to these properties and knocking on the door, and as you say, being a stranger, but actually asking for some food. Was it the norm in those days, or was it very, very unusual? And, I suppose historically, it is the start of trail magic as it's known today.
I was just going to ask you that, Bob. Do you all are familiar with trail magic?
Sure.
Yeah. So, all right. Yeah. So, well, she made her own trail magic. That's how I look at it. And by the way, I'm right in the middle of packing for a 4-day trip on the Florida Trail in North Florida. And I have brought along my, it's behind me. I won't mess with it. I brought along my jet boil, which, uses the gas mix. It's a compact little stove, and you get water boiling in 45 seconds if you want. And then we dump that into our backpacker pantry meals or whatever. And It rehydrates, and it's delicious, like a really good meal in about 5 minutes. She had none of this, right? So she ate berries, she ate nuts, she ate something that she called sorrel salad, which sorrel is a plant that grows in the Appalachian Mountains.
Yeah, yeah.
It is not it's not good. It tastes like grass. I've eaten it before. It's like a tart, bitter sort of plant. But she made a regular, she was eating this on a regular basis, especially when she was walking through the very rural stretches of the Appalachian Trail. Fortunately, the AT runs by quite a few towns, and you're never more than, 4 or 5 days hike from from a town or at least from a road where you can, catch a ride into a town. And so she made a habit of, like you said, of, introducing herself to strangers, to walking up to homes that she would, she'd see a light burning in the distance and think, I'm going to go try there. And she'd knock on the door. Somebody would answer. She would introduce herself. More often than not, people invited her in. If they didn't do that, then they would sometimes give her some extra food, send her off the next day with at least a meal to eat. But by and large, she made her own trail magic the entire route. I think she had about $200. By my calculation, she brought with her about $200 in folding money for that trip. And, and that's not a lot of money. If you want to do the AT today, it'd be a piece of cake to spend about 10 grand. So think about spending $200, over 145 days walk.
I think you worked it out as 10 cents a mile.
That's right. Yeah. People took care of her. And it's interesting you mentioned about the calories, because when I finished this manuscript, I sent it to I had not spent a whole lot of time on the AT myself by that point, but I sent it to a friend who had thru hiked. And this guy's an author. He's a dear friend. I said, read this and tell me what you think. And his response was, Ben, are you sure she did this? And for her to have lied about it would have taken, a lot of journal entries that name specific places and specific things and specific people that never happened, right? When in fact, she had met lots of people on the trail that I was able to verify. She had accounted for every single day, the mileage of every single day in her journals. This was not a person who was interested in making this up. She wanted to take a hike, and this is what she was going to do. But my friend said, he was burning about 4,000 calories a day on the trail and still having a hard time maintaining weight. He said, how is a 67-year-old woman able to do this? Just eating sorrel salad on some days, just eating, wild strawberries that she found trailside some days. And the fact is, she lost 30 pounds during this hike. Sort of a big deal, but she made it. I think it came down to relying on the goodwill of the people who lived along the trail to keep her fed occasionally. And that first hike was one thing. That was a big deal. In the intervening year, everybody that she had met on the trail, she took their name and their location. And so in the year between her first and second hike, she corresponded with them, telling them, hey, I'll be back next year, so make sure you look for me. And when she came back around, sure enough, these were friends of hers by this point. And so they would send her off often with sandwiches, with things to eat for the next day. She enjoyed visiting with the folks. And so that's how she made it.
So to put it into a simple question then, I suppose I'm just trying to grasp really for myself and anybody else watching, was it expected? Did she knock on the door and expect to have received something quite happily with no guilt as regards, let me do something for you, or let me give you a few cents for it, or whatever it may be? Or was that just the 1950s and the attitude of mountain people in those days?
Well, it was partly the attitude of mountain people. I think once you got past the suspicion and once they were comfortable with who you are, these are the best-hearted people in the world. You'll find that even today in the region that we call Appalachia. But she was not a stranger to anybody. And I think you have a photo of her with some boys. There's a great story, if you can put your fingers on that. She was nearing Orford, New Hampshire, and walked up to the door of a home, and I spoke with one of the gentlemen who's in the photograph with her. This was in 1955. And the way he recalls, he would have been 8 or 9 years old at the time. Yeah, that's the one. So the way he recalls, there was a knock at his mother was preparing dinner one evening. There's a knock at the door. They weren't expecting company, but his mother went and answered the door, and there stood Emma Gatewood, looking about like that, wearing a green eye shade and a bag slung over her shoulder, probably smelling to high heaven. And in his memory, he recalls her just kind of walking in, brushing right past his mother. And as she did, she said, "I'm Grandma Gatewood. What's for dinner?" And she sat herself down at the family dinner table and just pretended like it was, a regular afternoon. And of course, his mother fed her dinner. She told stories to the kids while they were eating. And she very quickly became, sort of one of the family until she left later that day. They were glad to have her as a visitor. And every year after, when she came back through, they knew to look for her, and they treated her well. So that's pretty much it. She wasn't a stranger. She was not afraid to, ask for something that she needed. And she needed help. She, could not have survived. She could not have done what she did just on, the nuts and berries and sorrel salad to be found along the Appalachian Trail. She needed sustenance once in a while, and was not afraid to ask for it. She's also very appreciative and very thankful. And like I said, she made friends with these people. It wasn't just a matter of them feeding her and sending her on her way. She would correspond in later years, and many of them she corresponded with for the rest of her life.
Thanks for listening to part 1. Part 2 is following shortly. And in the meantime, you can always pick up a copy of Ben's book, Grandma Gatewood's Walk, in numerous places. But of course, that book and others he's written are all available on Amazon. Until next time, bye for now.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. To hear or see more from our extensive free library, please visit theoutdoorstation.co.uk.